Welcome to this program in the Our Finger Lakes History Series. I am Seneca County historian Walter Gable. The topic of this program is the Finger Lakes National Forest, which is located on the Backbone Ridge between Seneca and Cayuga Lakes, with some of the national forest located in southern Seneca County and the rest in the national forest portions in northern Schuyler County. The Finger Lakes National Forest is the only national forest in all of New York State. Now you may think of the Adirondack Forest, but that is a state forest and not a national forest. The term Backbone Ridge refers to the area between Seneca Lake and Cayuga Lake that is partially located in southern Seneca County and partially located in northern Schuyler County. The area is shown in the map at left with the arrow pointing to the oval shape that locates this Backbone Ridge. The map at right shows that there is a significant change in elevation as you go from the east shore of Seneca Lake to the west shore of Cayuga Lake. You will note that the coloration in this topographic map changes from a thin strip of green along the Seneca Lake shore to a yellow and then a reddish brown. Then as you proceed east or left to right to the right, you will note that there once again is a yellow area and then a thin strip of green along the west shore of Cayuga Lake. The reddish brown area denotes a much higher elevation than the green area. Hence you can see that there is a ridge or a highest level of elevation between Seneca Lake and Cayuga Lake. That ridge is what has become known locally as the Backbone Ridge. This map shows perhaps more clearly the location of the Finger Lakes National Forest relative to Seneca Lake. Also, you can note at the very upright corner of the map is a small blue area that is a portion of Cayuga Lake. Note also the location of the Finger Lakes National Forest in that green relative to the village of Watkins Glen at lower left in the map. The Finger Lakes National Forest consists of a little over 16,000 acres. We are probably all familiar with national parks here in the United States. Some examples are the Women's Rights National Historical Park in Seneca Falls. National parks preserve historic buildings or places. In the case of the Women's Rights National Historical Park, preserved are the Wesleyan Chapel, the Elizabeth Cady Stanton home in Seneca Falls, and in Waterloo, the homes of the McClintock family and the Richard P. Hunt House. National forests basically preserve an important natural area so that people can enjoy its natural beauty and for recreational purposes. A national forest can also provide a refuge area for natural wildlife. A natural forest can also provide a source of timber and lumber, which actually is a way to help preserve good quality to the natural growth of trees. In the case of the Finger Lakes National Forest, for many years it provided a grazing area for commercial livestock. To begin to discuss the history of this area that became the Finger Lakes National Forest, let me first say that this was lands of the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee. After the American Revolutionary War, whites began to settle in this area. Of course, most of these white settlers were farmers. It was an area of rich soil, and the lands came to be more and more intensely farmed. Unfortunately, by about 1900, the typical farms in this Backbone Ridge, the farmers were making a marginal living at best. The soil was largely depleted of its natural fertility. The area was finding it increasingly difficult to compete with the large-scale farms of the Midwest. Because of this economic hardship, there was a population decline in this area, and many of the farms were simply abandoned. In 1935, as part of the New Deal, Congress passed the Emergency Relief Administration Act. Using that law, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, on May 1st, 1935, issued Executive Order 7027 to create the Resettlement Administration. This Resettlement Administration was authorized to buy the farms of farmers who were willing to sell, so that those farm families could relocate to an area where they could hopefully do productive work during these years of the Depression. Farmers did not have to sell their farmlands to the government, but many chose to do so. More specifically, for our Backbone Ridge area, over 100 farm families chose to sell their farms. Because some farmers chose to sell their farms and some neighboring farms did not choose to sell their farms, this meant there was a patchwork quilt of properties owned by the federal government. Here you can see more clearly the nature of this patchwork quilt of farms that were acquired by the federal government. At the left is shown the entire area that later became the Finger Lakes National Forest. At right, I have made a close-up of the Seneca County portion. You can see that a farmer decided to sell his farm, but in many cases a neighboring farmer did not decide to sell. The result was that there was not a uniform area, one uniform area totally owned by the federal government. By 1941, the lands purchased by this Resettlement Administration were formally managed as the Hector Land Use Area and was managed by the U.S. government's Soil Conservation Service of the Department of Agriculture. Where there had been significant erosion in the Backbone Ridge from the runoff of water, large numbers of conifer pines were planted to help stabilize the eroding hillsides. Most of the previously tilled farmland was converted to pasture land. By 1946, these pasture lands were ready to be used as grazing pastures for cattle. In 1946 came the formal organization of the Hector Cooperative Grazing Association to lease the pasture lands to nearby farmers. Until 1971, most of the federal-owned lands were leased to the Hector Cooperative Grazing Association. This Hector Cooperative Grazing Association, until 1971, could lease portions of the 35 fenced-in pastures totaling 4,500 acres. It could be leased to farmers so that their sheep, beef cattle, or dairy cattle could graze on those pasture lands between May 1st and November 1st. Initially, there were over 130 dues-paying members of this Hector Cooperative Grazing Association. Currently, however, there are 35 dues-paying members of this Hector Cooperative Grazing Association. The lands were a major leased grazing area success. Soil erosion concerns had been largely alleviated. In the early 1950s, public opinion was advocating more extensive use of public lands. In 1954, the administrative responsibilities for these hectare lands was transferred from the Soil Conservation Service to the U.S. Forest Service. As part of the U.S. Forest Service, there would be new emphasis upon wildlife conservation and public education and recreation. By the early 1970s, the continued future existence of these lands as part of the U.S. Forest Service came into question. The Cayuga Nation of Iroquois was claiming that their lands had been unjustly taken by agreements forced upon them by the state of New York. Efforts were being made to reach an out-of-court settlement with the Cayuga Nation. The Cayuga Nation insisted upon getting back lands as part of any out-of-court settlement they would agree to. One area of land considered as a possibility was the over 3,600 acres of these hectare lands in Seneca County. That never materialized as a formal out-of-court settlement agreement, however. Then in 1982, the hectare area was identified by the federal government as a possible land area to be declared as excess by the Forest Service so that it could be sold off without the approval of the U.S. Congress. Local residents were vehement in their opposition to any sale of these hectare land use area lands. Over 8,200 signatures were obtained on petitions to oppose any such public sale. Shown here is an article that appeared in the New York Times on February 20th, 1983. Our area representatives in the U.S. Congress at the time introduced legislation that would in effect prevent the U.S. Forest Service from selling these hectare lands without approval from Congress. To prevent the sale of these hectare lands in 1983, Congress passed Public Law 98-175, 97, Stat 1123, which gave national forest status to the former hectare land use area. In 1985, by a Secretary of Agriculture order, this area became known as the Hector Ranger District, Finger Lakes National Forest. This, I say again, is the only national forest yet today in New York State. Originally, this Finger Lakes National Forest was about 13,000 acres, but today it has been expanded to be a total of over 16,000 acres. Because of its small size, administratively, the Finger Lakes National Forest is a unit of the Green Mountain National Forest of New England. As I have alluded to earlier in this program, Some farmers simply abandoned their farms in the 1930s, and their farms and other farms were sold to the federal government. Shown here is the house and some small barns of the Warren Clark farm that became property of the Finger Lakes National Forest. I think this picture gives an idea of how so many of the farmers of these lands were typically having only a marginal existence by the 1930s. Here is a current sign denoting the area of the Finger Lakes National Forest. There are many kinds of recreational options within the Finger Lakes National Forest. You can hike, you can ride horseback, and see the beautiful natural sights such as these. You can also see all kinds of habitat, including species of butterfly. There are some grazing areas yet today, so if people open a gate, they need to remember to close the gate back. There is, in other words, some leased grazing lands, so you have to watch out for some domesticated animals inside fenced-in areas. You can camp in certain areas of the Finger Lakes National Forest. Here you see a group that had been riding on horseback taking a rest break. In wintertime, you can use your snowshoes or you can cross-country ski. The Finger Lakes National Forest owns a few acres near Kaywood Point on Seneca Lake. This area in the last quarter of the 19th century was known as Fossenview or Camp Fossenview. It was a summertime cultural and recreational camp established by Elizabeth Smith Miller and 6 others from Geneva, New York. The only remaining building of this summer camp is called Queen's Castle, and this building was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1999. I did a program on Fossenview as part of our Finger Lakes History series, so I encourage you viewers to watch that program for more information on Fossenview. In 2006, residents of the Finger Lakes National Forest area organized themselves as the Backbone Ridge History Group to help uncover and preserve the history of this Backbone Ridge. This Backbone Ridge History Group has done several public programs on the history of the area. Excuse me. It has helped clean up cemeteries in the greater Backbone Ridge area, and it has encouraged archaeological digs and research. Jody Vancelo is the current district ranger for the Hector Ranger District of the Finger Lakes National Forest. And when I asked her for a comment, this is what she provided. Quote, "The Finger Lakes National Forest is community built. The Hector land use area was managed by the Forest Service since the 50s as a land use area. It wasn't until the 80s when the land was considered for resale that the community, folks who've grazed, hunted, and hiked the area for decades, the community made it clear they wanted the land to remain public for multiple use. It is thanks to them, the community, that the area was declared the Finger Lakes National Forest in 1985. Forest partners, neighbors, and friends have been helping to manage the land long before it was a national forest, and we look forward to working with them for years to come. As a summary, I think you should now be able to answer each of these questions posed. I encourage you to consider going for a drive or even a horseback ride on portions of the Finger Lakes National Forest. I encourage you to view my program on Fossenview as another part of the Our Finger Lakes History series. I encourage you to consider attending upcoming programs of the Backbone Ridge History Group. In short, the Finger Lakes National Forest and its history is another important part of our Finger Lakes history.